Say 0. Going live. We are live.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion on open societies and their desires to close communications, mapping and fighting the internet shutdowns around the world. It is crucial for us to talk about internet shutdowns because the conversation on digital rights begins with access. And this access to the digital world itself is now being cut down by the government increasingly day by day for various reasons. We at SFLC are the voice for all those marginalized and deprived groups of people who are lurking in the dark without internet connectivity, even during COVID times. As some of you may know, we've been tracking internet shutdowns since 2012. And in furtherance of our efforts, we have built a new website with some very fascinating features. We've also made 3 very interesting films describing the menace of internet shutdowns in India. The films are available on YouTube and on our website, and we'll be playing a trailer here for you today. For today's panel, we have a very eminent group of individuals who are all experts in their respective spheres of work. This panel is going to be moderated by Gayatri Khandai. Gayatri works as the Asia Policy Regional Coordinator with APC. We'll begin with the video now.
January 2012. Even as the country celebrated its status as a free and sovereign republic, there were severe restrictions that were placed on the usage of internet. 26th January 2012. Even as the country celebrated its status as a free and sovereign republic, there were severe restrictions that were placed on the usage of internet in the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir.
The desire to control is universal. The authorities everywhere would like to have control. Whether it is the control over the free flow of information, or about the narrative, or about what what you and I would call free speech and expression and right to dissent or right to offend.
Largely dominated by mobile internet users, India is the second largest country-wise market in the world. It also happens to lead every other country in terms of the number of internet shutdowns imposed every year. The durations of these blockades is entirely arbitrary, ranging from 24 hours to 552 days. Oddly enough, records related to these shutdowns are not maintained by either the Department of Telecom or the Ministry of Home Affairs.
There was no space also to counter what the government was trying to say. So all these things contributed to creating a very, very sinister situation on the ground. And that, I think, is something that we are still unable to process.
That was the trailer for you. Log on to our website to watch all the movies, all the films. Over to you, Gayatri.
Hello. Hi, and welcome to the session. I'm Gaia, and I'll be helping facilitate this session. We have a fantastic gathering of activists and experts who've really been working on the issues of network shutdowns and its impact on the ground. So we'll be hearing different experiences, from national experiences to global experiences, including conversations around how these internet shutdowns are being documented and researched upon. So we will be joined by Laura Schwartz Henderson. Laura is a senior program officer of global technology at Internews. Annie Kame is the executive director of IFEX, a global network that defends and promotes freedom of expression and information as a fundamental human right. Oliver Spencer is an advisor at Free Expression Myanmar. And Chris Ruikork is a political scientist and lecturer in politics at PPLE, University of Amsterdam. Radhika Jalani is a volunteer counsel at sflc.in, and she heads the Internet Shutdowns and Free Speech Project at that center. So, what we would be doing is kicking off by listening to international perspectives, moving into national experiences around internet shutdowns, and talking a little bit about the technical aspects of reporting and documenting internet shutdowns, followed by a quick conversation around what are the needs of the groups on the ground and how advocacy around pushing back against internet shutdowns can be improved. Annie, can I start off with you? And perhaps we can kickstart the conversations around what are the different kinds of challenges that network shutdowns pose, especially to freedom of expression, to different groups, be it media, human rights defenders, civil society organizations. And in your experience in the last few years, do you see any kind of shifts, improvements, deterioration in how network shutdowns are being imposed?
Thank you, Gayatri, and thank you, SLCF, for inviting IFEX to participate in this series of discussions. You brought together a fascinating group of experienced people to discuss what has been an issue of great magnitude. These discussions are very important at so many levels for us to increase knowledge, make connections, sharing resources, and offering opportunities to collaborate. This is how we work at IFEX. As you can imagine, with over 120 organizations in the network, it's critical to have a space to interact on these issues, as we are constantly asked to learn and react at the same time in the current context. It's even more pressing to be increased with the increased attacks on civil society that we make these spaces available. So I was asked to think about the challenges network shutdowns have on the right to freedom of expression. And I thought of my colleagues from the network who've borne the brunt of the internet shutdowns and how it's impacted their lives. Then it came to me that there are many, like me, here in Canada, who have never experienced this and find it hard to imagine what it would be like to face a complete shutdown of the internet. Most of us freak out if we can't find our phone for 2 minutes. But then I remembered growing up in a family of 6 children who in our teens had very diverse musical tastes, all of which our father hated, and all of which we played very loud. So to manage this, he would go around the house and just pull the plugs out of the wall. Radios, CDs, record players, lights, television, and it would all just stop. It certainly had an impact. I know it wasn't the internet, but I think the message is somehow the same. There's a kind of violence in forced silence, something menacing. It serves as a reminder that you do not have the power. Your views or voice are not invited or required. If you disagree or say something wrong, you could be punished, and you're left there, silent and unsure when or if you will ever get those rights back. Sounds familiar. Internet shutdowns have evolved, and rather than being an aberration, they're now a tactic, a handy reflex in stemming dissent and hardwired into the playbook of oppressive regimes, which is why it's happening increasingly around the world in different iterations. The question asks, what are the challenges to free expression? Let me count the ways. I know we all know there are many. So I thought I would just share a few scenarios from our network outlining the problem, the impact and response from IFEX members experiencing shutdowns. Let's start with Indonesia. In 2019, with anti-racism protests in Papua and West Papua, the state shut down the internet for 2 months. This gave the state 2 months to conduct various human rights violations with impunity while violating the public's right to civic space and access to information. Following the internet's reinstatement, IFEX member Aji, along with others, launched a petition against the president, claiming the shutdowns and slowing down of bandwidth were unlawful. Amazingly, they won the case. The state failed to prove a state of emergency. Limiting people's right to information should be made in accordance with law, not state's discretion. Fake news should be handled through the criminal code, not blanket shutdowns. In Venezuela, very often internet shutdowns occur during protest or key political moments like elections. Cutting off access to information during these shutdowns impedes the democratic process and people's right to vote and express their opinions. IFEX members IPES Venezuela published a report about digital rights in Venezuela, And a bit like SLCF in India, organizations like Espacio Público and Venezuela Sin Filtro are monitoring internet blocks and posting critical alerts about interruptions and other attacks. In Uganda, the internet was shut down for 100 hours during the January 2021 elections. This included an all-out internet blackout and eventually restriction of social media platforms, which lasted for weeks. The president's justification for the shutdown was in retaliation to Facebook for taking down some pro-government accounts. Our members there listed the impacts of this kind of political repression: censorship, denial of information, hindering civic engagement, casting doubts on the electoral process, loss of revenue and livelihoods, citizens unable to communicate with friends and family, and increased healthcare issues as people were unable to access doctors or info on COVID-19. Despite their efforts, the biggest challenge, according to them, was that they were unable to hold the ruling party accountable. And accountability is the biggest challenge we're all facing in this regard. So overall, we know there's a huge impact resulting from these shutdowns. It is censorship and bullying to an incredible degree. It further punishes journalists who are already under fire for reporting uncomfortable truths, harassed, threatened, incarcerated, and unable to do their work in the public interest. We see non-government supported media organizations attacked, shuttered, and prevented from providing critical information to the detriment of the population. What we know is civic space online is integral to a vibrant civic space offline. Shutdowns undermine human rights and fundamental freedoms of assembly, association, and expression that form the basis of a democratic society. And they impact all users, especially marginalized groups and those in vulnerable situations. Shutdowns limit media freedom and the ability of journalists and human rights defenders to report on violations or abuses and to hold governments accountable. Shutdowns and restrictions also limit the dissemination of free flow of information, harm economic activity, contribute to social and political disorder, and negatively affect public safety. So the question also posed is, do we consider any improvements? Things are getting better. I say things are not getting better, but we are getting better in responding to things. More members and civil society groups are engaging in finding creative ways of fighting back. But there's also a cost. Civil society largely remains restricted in their capacity to conduct technical research and leverage collective advocacy efforts to bring about substantive policy changes. Our organizations are constantly having to pivot in our work to respond urgently to transgressions like shutdowns. Continually, we are asked to learn about emerging issues and gain expertise in order to champion human rights. It's crucial, but it's exhausting and unsustainable. We're being attacked, and if our voices are shuttered, it will leave a vacuum for democracy, and that will be the biggest impact. And civil society is the last thing that should ever be allowed to be shut down. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Maybe we can take that context and with the broader context and look at some of the country-specific examples, right? Oliver, can we perhaps hear from you about what the experience in Myanmar has been like in the past, but more specifically, maybe also in the context of the coup and how that's worked out? But it will also help us understand this a little bit better if you could talk to us about how these, if and how these internet shutdowns impact your security or your ability to do advocacy work.
Sure, thanks a lot. So in regards to the experiences of Myanmar in the past and under the coup, I think the first thing to talk about, given the hosts of this panel, is that over the past 3-4 years, Myanmar has looked directly at India to learn about how to deal with the emerging freedoms in the digital space. In many ways, they've looked to Modi's approach to Jammu Kashmir and almost copy-pasted some of those techniques into the Myanmar situation. obviously, these include internet shutdowns, SIM card registration, the kind of false idea of restoring 2G as though that is that real internet access. So definitely, whatever happens in India has an impact on the broader region. Mentioning the shutdown, obviously the country has had the world's longest internet shutdown, affecting 1.4 million people who had no access to the internet. Now is almost 2 years. At the time that shutdown was implemented, civil society were one of the issues that they were raising with the elected NLD government at the time was that although it's just one shutdown, it's about creating a precedent and establishing experience in running shutdowns. So there was a concern raised to the NLD quite significantly at the time that if this is a test run, it's very difficult to stop it being used and misused in the future. And obviously that's exactly what we've seen since the coup started, is that what was learned in that shutdown has been basically reapplied nationally. The shutdown itself that we've seen since the coup has been on many levels, in different ways and different approaches. But what you can say is that it's enabled the military to have time, given that they clearly weren't expecting such a massive public reaction. It's given them time to plan their digital strategy. We've seen a shift from a blacklisting approach to a whitelisting approach. We've seen the creation or the probable creation of an alternative internet network for large businesses. And just recently, over the past week, we've effectively seen them chasing out some of the last independent telcos in the country. In terms of the security and advocacy work, I mean, the first thing to say is that you can see that I'm clearly not from Myanmar. And one of the impacts is that my colleagues are still unwilling to appear publicly in order to protect their security. They're actively still, operating completely undercover. And that goes across civil society, of what little civil society still remains in the country. But in particular, I mean, talking apart from that, we can say that on the one hand, the internet has clearly made communication much easier and enabled bottom-up information exchange throughout the coup. And that did not exist under previous military crackdowns. Secondly, shutdowns have had the opposite effect, which is that they've equally devastated all communications, particularly at the local grassroots level, which, as you know, most people at the grassroots level rely almost entirely on mobile communications. And also, obviously, the shutdowns have enabled the military to hide their gross human rights violations and also to hide their digital violations, including. There are lots of rumors now about the military bringing in Chinese walled garden technology. I mean, these rumors have existed since the beginning, but we're already seeing that at least 70% of mobile subscribers are now facing live interception, where the military is sitting inside the telcos and monitoring communications and data. But just to end my 7 minutes on a positive note, I think it's also important to recognize that I've never witnessed such a rapid growth in public concern for digital rights overall. And also, it's been inspiring to see the collective attempts to get new digital skills and new tech to enable the digital fight back against the digital coup itself. So, to conclude, obviously it's a massive digital coup, but people, especially young people, have become extremely clever about how to get around it. The military has got a long and difficult road if they think that they can completely repress Myanmar's digital space.
Thank you, Oliver. And perhaps we can come back to you later to hear more about how people are resisting internet shutdowns, or how are they getting around communicating with each other. How has the movement in Myanmar really panned out? I think that's something really interesting that we could come back to perhaps. But one of the things that you said is really interesting, and it connects to what Chris may possibly be able to share with us, which is how the Indian sort of way of operation or operationalizing network shutdowns is actually having a spillover effect in other jurisdictions, right? Chris, and your report goes into how network shutdowns are implemented in India. Could you talk to us a little bit more about your report, and perhaps also a little bit about whether there's been any responses or pushback to your findings?
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, so my report has just been released. It's called Understanding India's Internet Shutdowns, and I was an OTF fellow, Open Technology Fund fellow, for the last 12 months, where I, together with the SFLC, carried out a research project on basically the politics behind India's internet shutdowns. I basically had two questions. So who exactly issues these internet shutdowns in India, and why are they issued? I did field work in two Indian states where many shutdowns are issued, both in Rajasthan, where after Jammu and Kashmir, most of the internet shutdowns are issued, and in West Bengal. And I combined that for my research with the data from SFLC on internet shutdowns to see what patterns and trends could be identified across the country. So to begin with the question, so who then in India is responsible for issuing these shutdowns? Well, when you look at the legal process and who is authorized to issue the shutdowns, it is IAS officers, kind of the elite service of India's civil service. And these people answer to their state government, and that is very important with regards to India's shutdowns. They answer to their state governments, and in fact, they can be transferred by the state government that they operate under in public interest. But in practice, this is oftentimes used as a tool for political manipulation. Okay, so loyal civil servants can get very good postings from their state governments, whereas officers aligned to opposing political forces, they oftentimes get assigned a very obscure posting, what is called a punishment posting. So if you want to understand who issues them, it's not enough to just look at who is authorized to issue them on paper, but you really should take into account that these bureaucrats, these IAS officers, answer to their state government, and they can be manipulated by their state government, which frequently intervene. So if we want to understand the politics behind the shutdowns, I think we should really look at the state level politics and at the state government. So then the question, why are they so often issued in India? Well, if you compare it, and I think it was just also mentioned, the shutdown in Uganda, for instance, what we see in Africa is that many shutdowns are issued during elections. Most recently in Uganda. And what is very surprising, actually, if you look at how often the internet shutdown is used in India, it's quite surprising that it's almost never used during elections in India. The only case that I came across was in Jammu and Kashmir, which is an exception in many respects, but also in the sense that an internet shutdown was issued there last December during the District Development Council elections. But in the rest of India, it rarely happens, if it ever happens, during elections. So when are they issued? Well, of course, there's the case of Jammu and Kashmir, where half of the shutdowns almost are issued. I leave that aside for now. I focus on other explanations for the shutdowns in the rest of India. So what my research shows is that internet shutdowns are far more often issued in states that are ruled by the BJP. So my research shows that a district that falls under a BJP government, the probability of a shutdown is 3.5 times higher. And if you look at why that is so, well, the explanations for these shutdowns and the justifications differ, but you do see many times they are used as a tool to suppress protest. You have the anti-CAA protest in December 2019, especially in Uttar Pradesh, of course. You had the recent farmer protests in Haryana, but also a few years back, the Patidar protests in Gujarat. All BJP states where the internet shutdowns was used clearly as a tool to break up dissent and protest. And then as a final explanation for the shutdowns, basically all the officials, the IAS officers that I spoke to, when I asked them why India has so many shutdowns, they all gave the same answer. It's because of the communal tensions. And the argument then is because there are anti-social elements in society who use social media to create communal problems that could potentially lead to communal riots, we have to shut down the internet. So we don't like it, but we have to because there are these evil forces in society, these anti-social forces that want to create communal havoc. And when you look deeper into the shutdowns that are issued in response to communal tensions, I think you find that these communal tensions do not just spontaneously appear, okay? Like numerous researchers have shown that these communal tensions in India are oftentimes deliberately provoked by groups that benefit from it, okay? They are anticipated and produced. So, and various like political forces have done this, but like oftentimes like Hindu nationalist forces close to the RSS have deliberately provoked communal riots for political gains. And you see that oftentimes, especially prior to elections, that communal problems are created to create a communal polarization, to kind of convince lower caste Hindus to vote along religious rather than caste lines, and to make the BJP a more appealing political party. So how are these communal problems then created that oftentimes lead to shutdowns? Well, you have misinformation and rumors that are deliberately spread. An example is 2017 in West Bengal's Baduria, where you had pictures of alleged Hindu victims of riots going viral, leading to communal clashes. These pictures were later proven by Alt News to have come from both Bangladesh, from a 2014 murder case, and from a Bollywood movie, but they nevertheless spurred the communal violence and eventually led to a shutdown. And the second reason how these communal tensions are oftentimes provoked is through Hindu processions that are oftentimes deliberately trying to incite, like creating communal problems by going through a Muslim neighborhood, by using insulting slogans, and so on and so forth. So 25 times my research shows that a religious procession led to an internet shutdown. So to wrap up, so I think that these shutdowns in response to communal tensions raise some very pressing questions, which is like, when, if ever, is such a shutdown permitted? And if these shutdowns are ever permitted, under what circumstances? And how can it be prevented that the executive abuses their powers? And finally, if we are fighting shutdowns in response to communal tensions, to what extent are we then not merely fighting the symptoms of a system that runs much deeper? So do we then not, like, is the real problem not the deliberate provocation of communal tensions and riots, rather than state authorities responding to it with a curfew and an internet shutdown? So that is a question to think about, I think. So I'd like to leave it there.
Thank you, Chris. Radhika, perhaps can we go to you from there to hear a little bit about, to enable the kind of work that Oliver is talking about, or the kind of work Annie was talking about, or the kind of researchers that Chris is talking about? You need sort of documentation of network shutdowns, no? And there's a little bit of difficulties around assessing what really is an internet shutdown and whether it's an official network shutdown. So, Radhika, can you talk to us a little bit more about how SFLC goes about documenting internet shutdowns, and how has the Indian state more specifically responded to the kind of figures that you're putting out?
So to answer your question, Gaya, today, because we have been doing a lot of work around internet shutdowns, and over the past couple of days, with the launch of the tracker and the films, we had put out quite a number of social media posts. We like one of my colleagues, who put out the figures for internet shutdowns, got a response on Instagram saying कि हमें क्या मतलब है इन figures से, basically translating it to why should we care about these figures. Why? Because again, internet shutdown still, I would say, before CA protest started in end of 2019, were a very hyper-local remote shutdowns. They would happen in some remote region in West Bengal or in some remote region in Rajasthan. And we know how big India is with so many districts and so many states. So nobody used to care, right? Why would anybody care about like a super hyper-local shutdown happening in one corner of the world? And then suddenly, after so many discussions and like so much, I remember we used to always talk about, oh, what if a shutdown happens in a city like Delhi, which is all of us are completely connected over internet. We work in offices, we use internet like anything. What if something happens like that? And on 19th December 2019, at Monday House in the capital of the city, in central Delhi, where all of the government offices are, there was a shutdown. And that is what got the international media to us, to actually get to notice that internet shutdowns is a problem. Otherwise, there used to be few and far between reports that, oh, there are shutdowns. I mean, Chris's report is a great resource because there are no reports. There are not too many reports on shutdowns because, again, why would you care, right? The pandemic has, of course, shown us a very different world altogether. We don't get reports to say there are barely any newspaper reports about shutdowns. There are no orders maintained by the government. These shutdowns are very state specific, except of course Jammu and Kashmir. You don't get any information from right to information applications that we file. I think the only state that has ever given us information is state of Rajasthan. There was a major landmark judgment called Anuradha Bhasin versus Union of India, which was filed in the highest court of the country because, again, like the region was without internet for no to low internet for 552 days in 21st century. There was yeah, and even now, like as back as 2 days back, there was a shutdown in Kashmir, and there were no orders, right? So it's not like it's not like today that that I know that tomorrow there can be an internet shutdown. These are so quick and they're so hyper local and they're so arbitrary that nobody really knows. And at this juncture we realize that how important it is to maintain some data, because information is the first resource that you can use to fight back. The way that we document internet shutdowns, and I might say this that it is quite a task because again, people are not aware of it. So even though we have like a reporting mechanism on our website, on our Twitter, if people don't know what an internet shutdown is, why would they report, right? They for people like for the country that it might just be like a minor thing that sim kharab ho gaya, we went in a bad network area or something like that, and we get such reports also. Then for newspapers, they are too short. A remote shutdown in one part of the country is too short. National newspapers won't cover it. It is only local newspapers in local languages who cover it, right? Citizens who are in that region, like not a lot of them have an idea. So the way that we do it is we use a combination of all of these things. Of course, like there is a lot more awareness now, so there are a lot more people documenting it. India recently signed like a G7 statement where it said that there won't be any politically motivated shutdowns, which we are yet to see if that's going to happen or not. But even before Jammu and Kashmir, this week only there was a internet shutdown in a district in Baran where a man was killed. So they just imposed Section 144 and imposed an internet shutdown. I think to further that, what we have done is we have put out some films. If whenever Because at least if nothing else, they can be provocating, and they can be educating towards people to just know what an internet shutdown is. Because unless you know, you won't be able to report. So to cut myself short, I think this is how we've been documenting it, and these are the problems that we face. There are no government records.
Radhika, could you perhaps give us a sense of what the figure looks like for 2021 in India,
So
roughly?
you want to know about 2021? Just I think there are 523 shutdowns in total since 2012. For this year itself, we have had 25 shutdowns.
Okay, so from what you're saying, if you're saying that it's not really possible to accurately capture this, so are you saying that maybe the figure could be a lot higher than what you're reporting?
I don't think so, because we are quite vigilant about it. But there might be a chance that we might have missed on one or two shutdowns. So to make sure that we fill this gap in, and of course, and we report as accurate as number possible, we have filed RTI applications. But the appeals, the first appeal, second appeal, takes some time. So you can estimate, like, if a shutdown has happened today, we might get a report in a month. So, for example, we might have heard about the Lakshadweep protests. There were a number of protests that happened in Lakshadweep, and it's a very remote island off the coast of Kerala. Very remote, very small. Like, I think it has a population of about 50 to 53,000. There have been some protests against the ruling government there, the administrator, and there was a reported shutdown on 31st April, right? But there are no 100 confirmed reports. So we filed an RTI. It has been transferred, and we're still waiting for a response. So in case that gets approved, then that number will go up on the website. Because still, again, we're 100% sure we will not be putting that up.
Thank you, Radhika. Laura, can we perhaps speak to you a little bit about what are groups like SFLC telling you in terms of what is it that they need in terms of being able to advocate around network shutdowns, or being able to document them the way perhaps how SFLC does. So what do you see as some of those immediate capacity or resource needs for these groups? And also in terms of your conversations with these different groups, do you have a sense of how we can take advocacy on pushing back against network shutdowns forward?
Great. Thanks, Gaia, and thanks to SFLC for inviting me to join this really amazing and extremely important panel. Just to introduce myself, I'm Laura Schwartz-Anderson. I work on a project at Internews called Optima, and through that project, we're trying to understand what community needs look like when organizations are preparing for, seeking to prevent, and advocating against shutdowns. So we're working with experts to build resources to also fill those gaps and identify those needs. The premise of this project is that due to the very nature of internet shutdowns, as many of the speakers on this panel have discussed, advocacy is often rapid response, and civil society is forced to mobilize during an emergency when a shutdown is imminent or occurring, and that's also when communication and organizing capacity is most curtailed. So what you have is a bit of a chicken or the egg problem. Civil society often doesn't have the expertise, the resources, or the capacity they need to fight shutdowns until they need to fight shutdowns. This also follows with funding and international attention, as many people have talked about. Once a shutdown happens, everybody wants to report on it. People want to give money. It's really hard to reach people. Additionally, as many of the panelists have noted, no two shutdowns are alike. So lots of variation, geographic scope of a shutdown. As Radhika mentioned, many are hyper-local. Who orders the shutdown? Chris noted in India, it's often the state government. The timing around political events, what triggers a shutdown? Elections versus other timing, as Chris said, in India. the legality of shutdowns. In some places, it's explicitly illegal. In other places, not so much. And then transparency. So whether or not you can find out how they were ordered and implemented. Governments also take different technical approaches. So we talk about shutdowns, but as many of you know, there are different ways that governments can do this. They can block social media platforms or applications. They can throttle internet speeds, or they can shut entire mobile or broadband networks. And then political context also matters. Shutdowns are unfortunately happening not just in more closed political contexts, but also established democracies. So what is possible for civil society as far as fighting back is different for Indonesia or India versus Venezuela or Tanzania. And so what we are trying to do is think through what advocacy responses look like and guidance for civil society groups in different contexts that are catered to the technical and political infrastructures and also capacities. And for that reason, last year we conducted a community needs assessment, receiving responses from 142 civil society organizations working on digital rights in 87 different countries where shutdowns have occurred or at risk of occurring, to find out about what advocacy groups feel their needs are, what their capacities are, and what their existing skills and resource gaps are. And how we as an international community, as donors, as implementers, can build resources and support mechanisms to better prepare civil society for possible shutdowns, and also how to broaden coalitions and improve stakeholder outreach and build more sustainable long-term campaigns. So the report is pretty comprehensive, and I won't be able to go over all of the things that we found, but it is available on our website. And first, top-line findings, unfortunately, and also unsurprisingly, we found both the threats and the needs are high. 60% of organizations report that a shutdown in the next year is likely or very likely. And we also asked organizations about what kinds of shutdowns they expect to happen. And actually, the highest rated potential threat was for bandwidth throttling or slowing the internet. And as some of the other panelists have mentioned, this is a particularly challenging way to shut down the internet because in low bandwidth contexts, the internet's often slow. And then also it's pretty difficult to verify methodologically. So one of our respondents described the government can just justify the throttling by the weak infrastructure over and over again, and we can't prove it. 49% of our respondents assess the capacity of advocacy in their countries as either weak or non-existent to respond to shutdowns, and 84% of the respondents who had never worked on shutdowns before said they had no preparatory measures in place in case a shutdown occurred. And as I mentioned in the beginning, organization reported that there are resource constraints to working on these issues because of the sort of reactive, rapid response nature of shutdowns, leading to short-term campaigns that focus on ending a shutdown with money sort of drying up after a shutdown has ended, and very little for longer-term advocacy. We specifically asked organizations about their capacities for important internet shutdown advocacy skills. Really importantly, and this I think goes back to what Radhika said, organizations recognize the importance of citing clear evidence and documentation of the duration, nature, and cause of a shutdown. That could be legal evidence and also technical evidence, and evidence collected via human reports. But nearly half of the respondents indicated they had little or no capacity to collect and interpret this data. Organizations also said they have little capacity to work with lawyers and think through strategic litigation, largely due to limited funding and the costs associated with lengthy legal processes and little understanding of the mechanisms through which you can go at the national or regional level. They also reported the need for better outreach to communities that are most at risk and least digitally savvy when it comes to preparations and the development of community plans at the grassroots level. And low levels of engagement with ISPs and telcos. In some cases, engagement is difficult because those private sector organizations are associated with the government, but in other cases, they might be more independent, but very little awareness of the differences between those and the possible spaces for engagement. And then also low levels of engagement with other sectors that are impacted by shutdowns, like health, mobile money, tourism, education. They also reported that it's difficult to engage in shutdown advocacy in low bandwidth contexts because governments can claim shutdowns are technical issues, as I mentioned, and citizens are also more normalized to an internet that occasionally or frequently doesn't work. So responding to some of those needs in the report, we built a series of recommendations for implementers and donors who are working in this space, and that has also guided our own programming. One thing was the need to build comprehensive resources on internet shutdown advocacy for before, during, and after a shutdown, to contextualize and localize these resources for very specific political, technical, and social contexts and impacted communities, to invest in longer term networks and relationships and provide resources on how to build spaces for engagement with the private sector and other key stakeholders, to build capacity for groups within at-risk countries to use network measurement tools and methods for documentation and to make those tools more user-friendly. And additionally, I'll add, to think through expanded methodologies and sources of data. It's very hard, as Radhika said, to verify when a shutdown has happened technically, especially throttling, and there's a need to bring researchers together to think through how to do this better. Also, Radhika mentioned it's super difficult because this is often really hyper-local, and that's also very difficult to measure. And then finally, there's a need to connect advocacy around shutdowns to advocacy around connectivity challenges broadly and the digital divide. If you don't see a difference between the internet being shut off when the government shuts it off and your regular access to the internet, makes it hard to push back. So responding to this over the past year, our project has sought to collect relevant internet shutdown resources that have been produced from organizations in the community and build comprehensive guides through a couple of categories. So network measurement and documentation, drawing on a number of resources from SFLC, using their tracker methodology, but also from organizations that do network measurement like UNI, IOTA, and MLab. We built a training that can be taken synchronously and asynchronously on network measurement and how to use this data in research and legal documentation and internet shutdown advocacy. A lot of questions exist around what circumvention tools work in different types of internet shutdowns. So we built a guide on which tools work in different contexts and also the security trade-offs. There's a real need to build support for advocacy and coalition building at the grassroots level. As Chris mentioned, engaging with state governments, thinking about not just naming and shaming at the international level, but who is responsible for these orders and how do we build strategic plans that really think through that, and working with new sectors. So we've built a number of reports documenting the impact of various shutdowns on health outcomes, on the education sector, as well as with specific communities like women, people with disabilities, and journalists. And then finally, we've produced a few guides to understand national and regional legal mechanisms and court systems, but there's a real need for funders to come in and think through what are the strategic litigation opportunities and how can you fund those things in the long term. Just to close out, we've pulled all those resources together along with a number of other amazing resources that other organizations have put together. And right now we're building a sort of interactive report you can take that builds on the needs assessment we built a year ago, but allows an organization in a country to take a survey and then get back a curated list of resources and their risks. And we are working with organizations in specific countries to have them use that report to send to partners to learn a little bit more about their own risks for shutdowns and also what resources already exist out there and to continue to identify the needs. So we're really interested in working with other people who are working in this space and expanding to new countries. But I think I'll just end by saying no internet shutdown is alike, and it's one tool in the toolkit that governments use. And so we really need to think holistically about what our advocacy strategies look like and how we're supporting the people who are most impacted in a long-term and sustainable way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Laura. That's really interesting, and I hope people get to look at your report and kind of look at the findings and think of ways to get the resources over to the different groups. We are going to open the floor up for questions, and they're just coming in. But I had a question for Oliver. Given the situation in Myanmar, I think Oliver should tell us a little bit more about how people are coping with network shutdowns in a world where it gets really difficult to communicate without the internet, right? So, how have people on ground been pushing back? And do you feel like there has been reasonable or satisfactory international attention to the network shutdowns in Myanmar? Um, is it only UN or are there other spaces responding to the network shutdowns in Myanmar?
Sure, thanks. So you asked that question earlier, so it gave me a bit of a time to write a list. I mean, what aren't they doing? I guess is the first answer. Off the top of my head, the response, we've got mass VPN use. I mean, mass, like everyone from your granny to your kid. Bluetooth mesh networks, foreign SIM card use for international roaming, huge Wi-Fi sharing approaches, big shifts in digital anonymity, particularly on Facebook and so forth. Huge increase in citizen journalists using digital tools. Big growth in encrypted communications. Who knows anybody anymore who uses unencrypted communications in Myanmar? The digital memes, digital humor, mockery. Myanmar's very important is around poetry and literature and digital forms of that. Massive digital coalitions of whatever CSOs still remain that are basically operating as a coalition in the digital space. And also, of course, not to mention, there's been a complete shift from broadcasting to almost entirely digital media. And because of that, obviously, the democratization and the creation of many new media outlets, many at the grassroots and local level, all trying to utilize what digital space they can get. In regards to your second question, just I think in terms of shutdowns themselves, I think it's important to recognize, and others have said that, and Radhika in particular, that they feed off and reinforce inequality. So ending shutdowns is also about ending inequality. What you don't see very much of is, and we need to improve, is shifting from it being a digital rights narrative to it being a sustainable development narrative. And because that shift hasn't happened, those of us working on it are, digital rights people. We don't see huge business interest. We don't see big interest from, the large development organizations. We don't see that much interest from the UN. And certainly very little interest from sort of large global banks and financial institutions. So I think key to shutdowns is about shifting the narrative away from it being just another rights issue to being a much larger issue and closely related to inequality.
Thank you, Oliver. I mean, it's really interesting to hear and also see the different ways in which people in Myanmar are pushing back. And it's unfortunate that they are in a position where they have to, but it inspires confidence in some ways of pushing back and for the resistance to perhaps pave way for the internet to remain unaffected. No, I also had another question before moving on to the questions from the floor. Chris, when you were talking about the Indian experience of documenting the Indian experience, I was wondering whether during your research did you come across examples, or do you feel like the Indian experience is unparalleled, or do you think there are other jurisdictions that are also imposing internet shutdowns similarly?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've thought about that actually, and especially with regards to the last point that I made on the shutdowns that are so often issued in response to communal tensions. Uh, like there are so many countries around the world that that we call kind of emerging democracies where like social media has like diffused and has democratized in the sense that a large part of the population now has access to these media and has a society with very strong ethnic, religious, whatsoever cleavages. So, in that respect, I don't think that the circumstances, like the communal tensions that are very much present in India, are that unique. So that bears the question, I think, that why are they so oftentimes in India then responded to with an internet shutdown and less so in other countries? Although you do see that oftentimes in other countries also as well, but not as much as in India. So that's really a question to me. I think part of the answer perhaps is just like that the use of the internet shutdown among bureaucrats has just become a normal response for officials to respond to kind of communal problem, and some officers that I spoke to even admitted that it has become the easy option, and rather than a measure of last resort, it's the first thing that they do. So if there might be a communal problem, the first thing you do is you shut the internet down. So I think it's also just the way things work now in India, and that's highly problematic. Yeah, that would be my answer, I guess.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to take a question from the floor, and I'm wondering if maybe Annie can respond to this. But if anybody else has thoughts on this, please jump in. Radhika, Laura, if you have views on this, please do jump in. Annie, the film we looked at, we watched together in the beginning. It and this question kind of reminded me of something Radhika said, no, about how people just don't realize, or it seems like people don't care about internet shutdowns. So this question was asking, this person is asking, how would these films um, aid advocacy around internet shutdowns? As someone who's worked on freedom of expression for a long time, what do you see as the role of visual interpretations and explanations like this film in advocacy?
Yeah, I think it's part of a much larger toolkit, but one that's very important, and one our members depend a lot on in terms of informing the public of the issues. And I think you're saying, sometimes in humorous ways or critical ways, it elevates the issues. I think it's not the only way, and just in terms of people who don't understand the issue. There's also people who agree that it's a good thing to do, and so I think sometimes the governments are very good, or the authorities are very good at convincing people that this is for their own good. This is anti-terrorist. This is stopping, protests. This is a safety issue. So I think we're always trying to counterbalance those statements. So I think communications, visual communications, social media is a good way of attacking those.
Thank you, Annie. Maybe I can take the next question. And maybe Radhika, maybe you could help us with this one. I'm probably going to combine a couple of questions here, but in your experience of looking at the legal aspects of internet shutdowns, or how the procedural aspects of internet shutdowns, do you see any kind of executive safeguards existing against the issuance of, against the imposition of internet shutdowns? And if that is missing, say if that's missing, what really do you possibly see as kinds of ways, or current kinds of ways of doing advocacy in this political setup?
Right. So India does have these rules earlier before 2017. Section 144, which is sort of like an umbrella section to just curb dissent all the time, used to be implemented to, like do network shutdowns. After that, in 2017, there was something called temporary suspension of telecom services rules that were notified by the government of India under the Indian Telegraph Act, which give the power for the executive to review the shutdowns done by the executive. So I'm sure you can understand the irony in that. So I mean, it has things like there is a procedure. There are certain, like, there are certain reasons why you can shut down the internet, like integrity, sovereignty, public safety, public emergency. And in our experience, the reason that is cited the most is public safety and public emergency, and also of course cheating in examinations, because that's a big issue for public safety and public emergency, and sometimes shutting it down during wrestling matches. But and so the problem with these shutdowns is, one way to work around these laws is to be able to challenge them in court. Now these shutdowns are so short, except of course Jammu and Kashmir. They are like 1 day shutdowns, 2 day shutdowns in some remote district. So by the time you end up reaching the court to be able to challenge it, those shutdowns practically end. And this is what happened. We tried doing this in one district in Hooghly. This is in Calcutta, near Calcutta, West Bengal. That it was a 6 day long shutdown. By the time we realized that there's something that has happened and we reached it, they had restored it. This happened again in Delhi in the 19th December one. I mean, the case is still pending in the Calcutta High Court, but that's what generally ends up happening. I mean, so it's basically like roadblocks. Now, a lot of parliamentary committees have taken cognizance of it after the issue has sort of become big enough for them to be able to report on it. But now, like, there are these new tactics that are being used, as like a lot of panelists spoke about, Laura spoke about it, that there's network throttling, right? During the farmers' protest, every time you cross Tikri border and like these borders, your network speeds gets reduced to 2G. And sites are so heavy these days that there is nothing that loads on 2G. So effectively, you're without internet. In Lakshadweep as well, like this is what we're confused about. If it's like a government imposed shutdown, or if it's just a case of network throttling. And how do you circumvent these? How do you hold the government accountable to it? That no, this is a shutdown, this is when they might just say, oh, it's a remote region, so there might be network throttling. So I mean, there are these new issues that have been coming up.
Thanks, Radhika. That partly also answers another question that was in the chat about how has the judiciary been approaching internet shutdowns. Because Annie mentioned the Indonesian order, and then there's of course reports from the UN that have termed internet shutdowns as being illegal as far as international human rights law goes. Do any of you have any reactions about how courts have been responding to internet shutdowns? Is that your way of saying courts are not responding to internet shutdowns? No?
I'll just say that in talking to the groups that we work with in lots of different countries and regions, it's really complicated to bring these cases, especially when there's not precedent. Internet shutdowns are relatively new. And also there are, depending on which court system you're trying to bring your case, there's a lot of requirements, and they can be dismissed for many reasons, and they've been successful in some places, and it's I think it's building that case law in different regions and in different countries, slowly but surely, in picking the cases that are most strategic in different jurisdictions, and I think there's a real hunger for doing more of that work. It just requires an investment, and really thinking strategically about what that looks like in certain regions and in globally.
I can say in the Myanmar context, before the coup, obviously now there are no courts, but before the coup, we did look to the Indonesian win. I mean, after Indonesia had their win, we did consider taking it to a court, but was really needed a telco for standing in the court, and we couldn't get the telcos to agree because their legal counsel simply told them you're going to lose. So what's the point? You're not only going to lose, but also the regulator, which in Myanmar's case is the ministry, is going to hate you and it's going to ruin all your relationships going forward. So we tried to convince them that actually there are two objectives with these kind of court cases. One is to win. One is just to raise public awareness of the illegality and the unlawfulness of the shutdown, which it was in Myanmar. But unfortunately, they were just not interested in the public awareness aspect. It wasn't enough benefit for them.
Thank you.
I'll just, if I can also just plug, in a lot of courts, in order to have standing, you need to have evidence. And so again, this is another need for being able to document more robustly, because that's such a important piece of this. A court can dismiss your case if they feel that you don't have enough evidence that this actually happened. And I think that relates to, engaging with a telco or an ISP, but also in being able to collect empirical evidence and make the strong case for that. So another promo to more network measurement work and training, and development with those communities.
Thank you, Laura. I wanted to open up the space now for the panelists to see if any of you had any last words to get in, or if something came to your mind when the others were speaking. This would be your last opportunity to be able to share that, or simply you wanted to share your predictions for the near future about whether network shutdowns are going to increase or stay as they are. You're welcome to do so, but this would be the opportunity to do that.
I just wanted to mention, the Anuradha Bhasin judgment, this was a major landmark case that was hopefully supposed to, change the face of internet shutdowns. But as we move forward, we really haven't, seen anything move further because, after as this is the big argument that India loves using, that there is nothing in front of public security and public emergency, right? And the integrity of the nation. So maybe we, and like the only thing that the government really listens to are numbers. So the top 10 VPN report estimated that there were over, I think, over 20 billion, lost in the Indian economy for the amount of internet shutdowns that were in 2020 alone. And that's a very conservative number, I would say, because there's so much informal economy that's happening right now. It also aids to like so many things that we don't talk about, like mental health. Imagine like in a conflict-ridden area such as Kashmir, not being able to, everything we do is over internet, not being able to do anything. These are hugely, largely unexplored, undocumented, untalked about things of internet shutdowns. Students not being able to go to school, not being able to attend your classes, not being able to talk to your parents for 100 days, not being able to see their faces over video calls. So shutdowns are much more than what they look like, and it's really time that all of us start fighting against them and we let the network.
Thank you, Radhika. It's also really interesting because there's a trend of courts and legislators across the globe arguing for the access to the internet to be recognized as a right. There have been many instances where courts have come very close to saying it's actually not possible for many rights to be exercised without uninterrupted access to the internet. But that argument being on one side, you have internet shutdowns, which basically take you away from the internet with such ease. So it's really sort of really confusing in that sense. And I hope that we'll have greater clarity from policy, from people in power, also from courts going forward. That said, thank you so much. This was such a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed speaking to all of you. Stay safe, and I hope we remain connected. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice
Be
to
sure
meet
to check
everyone.
out the films. All right. Bye bye.
Bye.